Hello, we've reached the third and final video in our three-part series looking at forthcoming changes to benchmarks. In this video, we'll be focusing in on the EU benchmarks regulation, which is scheduled to come into force from January 2018. As the implementation deadline approaches, it's critical that market participants know what the changes are and how they will impact their use of benchmarks. To help explain some of the issues, I'm joined by Rick Sandilands, Senior Counsel for Europe at ISDA. Rick, let's go back to basics. What exactly is this regulation and who does it affect?
At its simplest, the benchmark regulation sets out strict rules for benchmark administrators and contributors and prevents the use of non-compliant benchmarks in the European Union. Administrators based in the European Union will have to apply for separate registration or authorization, and those located outside the European Union, so-called third country administrators, will have to qualify under a regime of either equivalence, endorsement or recognition. I think it's worth pausing for a moment here to consider the scope of the benchmark regulation. I've had a number of firms say to me that they don't use benchmarks, but the definition of benchmark in the regulation is so broad that it encompasses interest rates, commodities, equities, FX rates and credit indices. There are narrow exemptions available, but I think if you're a financial institution in the capital markets space or you're the client of a financial institution operating in the capital markets, you're likely to be impacted by this regulation.
You talked about the need for benchmark administrators to register under this regulation. So how exactly does this affect a typical benchmark user?
Well, I think users will find the supply of products that reference non-compliant benchmarks effectively shut down. That may impact their ability to hedge exposures which they've acquired through their day-to-day business dealings, or their ability to acquire exposure for the purposes of their investment strategies. And there are a couple of points I think that are worth noting here. The first is that the benchmark regulation only directly applies to a limited number of users, so-called supervised entities. But those supervised entities are effectively the firms that supply products to the markets. So you have credit institutions, investment firms, insurance companies, and certain funds like UCITS and alternative investment funds. So I think that the effect of regulating those entities will in fact be magnified across the market. The second point to note is that there are some transitional provisions which will allow the continued use of existing benchmarks all the way out till 2020. But those transitional provisions don't apply to new benchmarks, and they also don't apply to significant obligations under the regulation. One of those obligations relates to supervised entities having to put in place plans to deal with benchmarks ceasing to exist or materially changing that are referenced in their products. The regulation requires those plans to include nomination of one or more alternative benchmarks in the event that the original benchmark ceases to exist or materially changes, and also requires that those plans are reflected in client contractual documentation. And that's really where you may find an impact on industry standard documentation such as the ISDA definitions.
So how can firms find out if the benchmarks that they use are actually going to be affected by this?
Well, ESMA will publish a list, so eventually that will become a straightforward task. I think it's worth noting, though, that none of the infrastructure required in order for firms to register or be authorised as an administrator of a benchmark in the EU, nor for equivalence, recognition or endorsement in terms of third country benchmark administrators, has yet been put in place. So there's a certain level of uncertainty existing there. And that's magnified by the fact that there's also uncertainty around whether central bank-produced benchmarks are also in scope. Central banks themselves are exempt as administrators under the regulation, but it seems that the authorities still want use of their benchmarks to be within scope under the regulation. In the face of this uncertainty, we are encouraging our members to produce inventories of the benchmarks that they use or will want to use in the future, and also to make a note of the date that they first used those benchmarks so that they're prepared for any contingency as it arises.
So what's ISDA's role in this?
Well, it should have become clear that there are significant areas of uncertainty remaining within the benchmark regulation with 6 months to go until its implementation date. So ISDA is working hard with its members and regulators to try and identify those areas of uncertainty. and to lobby for clarification where it's required. ISDA is also taking the lead through initiatives such as this one to try and raise industry awareness of the benchmark regulation and its impending implementation date. We're particularly concerned that perhaps it's getting swamped by firms' efforts in relation to MiFID II, and that's something we know that the regulators are also keen to raise on their part as well. ISDA has formed 2 working groups, one of which is looking at the broader issues raised by the benchmark regulation, and one is looking specifically at the documentation impact that it may have and whether amendments might be required to the ISDA definitions. And finally, I think as issues develop and news comes through, we will look to put on more webinars such as this one on our website.
Thanks, Rick.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our quick tour of changes to financial benchmarks. It's clear that a lot of important changes are underway. The transition to risk-free rates, the development of robust fallbacks to key IBOR contracts, and the launch of the EU benchmarks regulation. ISDA will continue to keep members up to date with any changes, but please do contact ISDA's legal department if you have any questions at isdalegal@isda.org.